And so we have been talking about mentorship and investing in others. Amen? And we've been talking about different things about mentorship, why it's important, how you do it. And so today we're going to talk about two specific people that had a type of mentorship relationship. And in doing so, we want to talk about how we can encourage others to follow God's leading, how we can encourage others to follow what He's telling us to do, how He's telling us to do it, regardless of the cost. And that's the hard part, because we can feel led by the Lord, but what is the cost of us then acting on being led by the Lord? And so we're going to be talking about Mordecai and Esther. Have you guys been familiar with that story of Mordecai and Esther? No? Esther is a book in the Bible. It's the name of a book in the Bible, and Esther is one of the characters in that Bible, in that book. And we're going to talk about them a little bit. But first, I want to get into why we're talking about them. What do we mean by cost, right? Because we usually associate cost with like businesses, right? And we have big corporations, right? We have like Coca-Cola, Walmart, Target, Chevron, right? To name a few of the many big corporations we have in this country. And at the end of the day, how do they conduct business? What is the purpose of their business, right? It's their bottom line. And what is their bottom line? How much money are we going to make, right? So every decision that they make is based around, is this going to make us money? Is this going to bring in profit, right? Every decision is based around, if we invest money into this, are we going to get our investment back and then some, right? It's their bottom line. That's all they care about at the end of the day, right? So how do they do this? They figure out something called a cost-benefit analysis, right? And it's just a lot of math where they put like, well, this is what it's going to cost us to do this, and this is the expected outcome, money-wise, right? And all their decisions are based around this. And sometimes people live their lives like this, right? We make decisions in a similar fashion. We don't just weigh the pros and cons, but we also weigh the cost against the outcomes. Like, what is this going to cost me, right? Is this going to cost me time? Is this going to cost me money? Is this going to cost me energy? And then we turn around and say, and what do I get out of it then, right? If I spend my time doing this, what do I get out of it? Sometimes we also think about our money costs too, right? Like, well, if I give this money to do this, what do I then get in return, right? And sometimes it's like for our investments, for retirement, but sometimes it's for things like college, right? Like, well, this is what I want to do, and this is what I can expect to make if I go into this career, and it's going to cost me this much time, this much money to go to college and get this degree so I can do this career, right? But Christian life isn't so, and it shouldn't be so, especially in leadership, right? Our lives are set up in a way that we are expected to invest without running that cost-benefit analysis. We're expected to invest without first trying to figure out, well, what is the benefit out of this? And it's risky. It's hard sometimes because we're not looking for the profit. We're not looking technically for the results, and we shouldn't be looking for the results, right? Sometimes that investment, though, is comes at a heavy cost, right? It comes at a heavy toll, right? If you're going into full-time ministry, what are some of those tolls that you are going to endure? Well, maybe you have small children. That's going to be a cost for them too, right? Because now mom and dad have their time split between ministry and children, right? Sometimes the risk involved, too, of even putting ourselves or those that we're investing in into dangerous situations, right? Sometimes we send people out into the world to preach the gospel as missionaries, but sometimes they go into dangerous places and dangerous situations. But regardless, God still wants us to be willing to invest, right? Even if we don't see the results, even if we can't even imagine the results. And that analysis, right, that cost-benefit analysis, that belongs to God. Like, He has done it in his heaven math, and it somehow works out. And we just have to trust that it does. We rarely keep ourselves, however, from trying to figure out, like, what's the benefit? If I do this, then I get this, right? And even as a church, when we plan things, right, Even if we feel led by the Lord to do things, we still try to run that analysis. Well, what are our expected outcomes? What do we want out of this? Right? We're going to invest this. We're going to invest resources, time. We're going to ask people to invest resources and time. What are we getting out of this at the end? Right? But God's timing isn't ours. Sometimes we're not going to see the results, right? We may never see the fruit of our labor and our investment in that thing. However, if we invest in people, the time will come when God will use them, but it'll be his time, right? Not ours. And Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow, right? So Paul did the initial outreach and preaching in evangelism. Apollos continued and followed up with them, but then he says, but ultimately it's God that's going to make this grow, right? And Paul left, right? He didn't get to see the fruit. The fruit is still waiting to bear, but it hasn't happened. And so before we go into the details of the message, let's look at the context of the story of Esther, right? And the backdrop of the story is we're in the Persian Empire. It's a long, long time ago, like once upon a time, right? Kind of way, way, way back in the Persian Empire. And Israel had been exiled because the Persian Empire had sieged Jerusalem and had taken people captive from Israel and taken them to the Persian Empire. And the king in the time of Esther was Xerxes. At that time, however, the Jewish people were in danger of being wiped out under Xerxes. And partly because of their transgressions, but partly because of a man that had decided to stand up against Jewish people. But God used Mordecai and Esther to preserve his people. And so, although God's name doesn't appear in this book, it can be observed that God is never far from his people, and God is acting throughout the entire narrative. So let's go to Esther chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Is it up there? Yeah, all right. It says, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So we have Mordecai, who had been taken into exile. We also have Esther, who had probably been born in Persia, right? And she was orphaned. We don't know how she was orphaned. We just know that she was orphaned. And Mordecai, her cousin, began raising her as his own. In a moment of drunkenness, though, King Xerxes requested the presence of his wife, his initial wife, Queen Vashti. And he wanted to show her off, right? His beautiful queen, because he was drunk and was really boastful and proud that he had a beautiful wife. But he wanted to boast her in front of lewd eyes, in front of people that were just going to be ogling her. And it's believed that the way that he wanted to present her was naked. And she was like, I'm not about to do that, because she understood the consequences of that. She understood the humiliation in that as well, right? And so faced with this humiliation, she said no. But now the king felt humiliated. And so his advisor said, well, you have to reject her as queen. And so even if she wanted to then rectify it, once he made an edict, and once he said, I'm leaving you, you're no longer my queen, that was it, right? It was an irrevocable decision by the king. On top of that, though, the act of disobedience from a wife to her husband, right, it implied not just a snub for a king, but the entire empire, right? It was a snub that represented that any woman now could snub her husband in any way, and so he couldn't allow that as well. So he needed to preserve that authority, right? And so verse 5 that we just read tells us that Mordecai was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, and Susa was the capital of the Persian kingdom. And so he was in the citadel, right, which is the palace. And we learned that Mordecai lives in the royal palace, right? So he occupied some sort of high position, right? Because as a Jew, he had no reason to be in the palace unless he had something specific to do there. And so he had some importance in there, right? He probably knew or had some special skill that the king needed, and he used him there. Verse 6 gives us context about Mordecai's life. He said he had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. And so under the leadership of King Nebuchadnezzar, Jerusalem was sieged, and they took captives from Judah, right? About 3,000 people. And they were especially rich and well-educated people that came from wealthy families, right? And so Mordecai was in there, right? He was either wealthy or really skilled. Mordecai, verse 7, had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman was also known as Esther. So he had dedicated his life to raising his cousin Esther, right? We don't know how they died, like I said, but even though she was left orphaned, he decided to pick up where her parents left off and care for her. And surely he's older than her because she obeys him in everything. She's very respectful of him. She obeys him in everything that he requests. And so there's this dynamic of kind of authority over her, even though they're cousins. And he was more like a father figure to her than just her regular cousin, right? And so we don't know if Mordecai was married or if he had other children, but Esther was like a daughter, and that's what's established in this narrative. And it says that the young woman had a lovely figure and good looks. And we'll see why that's important in a little bit. Like, why is he talking about her looks? We'll see why that's important in a little bit. I'm not just saying it because, like, oh, look, she was pretty. It makes sense later, right? However, right, her greatest beauty was her prudence, right? And the story shows us that. It's implied that Mordecai raised her in such a way that added prudence and tact to her attributes, including the physical ones, right? Mordecai adopted Esther, and he mentored her throughout her life. And so it's never too late to serve as someone's mentor, right? Like Mordecai, he was able to change an orphan's life through adoption, right? And so here we see Mordecai investing into Esther's life without knowing what will come of his efforts, right? He wasn't just trying to provide a roof over her head and food for her to eat and survive, right? He was pouring into her. It was obvious that he was pouring into her emotionally and spiritually as well, right? And he was giving her a foundation, right, that was based on faith and God's values. And so knowing what we know about the backdrop of the story, we can ask ourselves, is adversity a reason to be discouraged from being a good mentor, right? It's like, oh, well, my cousin has been left without a father or a mother. What do I do? Right? Can you imagine being a parent figure to your cousin? Some of us have crazy cousins, right? Imagine your wildest cousin. Imagine you becoming a parent figure to them. Right? Obviously, Esther was prudent, right? So he didn't have to worry. But it was still a challenge, right? And in adversity, he stepped up, right? He became a parent to her. And so we shouldn't be discouraged in adversity to step up, right? And the story we're following, everything that Esther learned under Mordecai would be put to test when there was a plot against the Jews. So, right? So now we remember the king had let go of his wife. And so the king can't be without a queen. So he created a kind of a beauty contest to pick his next queen, because it can't just be anybody, right? It has to be the most beautiful woman out there. It has to be the queen. If we know anything about olden kings and even new kings, right, it's always got to be the prettiest one, right? Even when they're not so beautiful looking, but it's like, no, but my wife and queen has to be beautiful, right? And so, just following with the old ways, right? So he was like, we need his advisor was like, let's do a contest, and let's create a contest so that you can choose your next queen. And we'll bring the most beautiful women in the entire empire, and you can choose one of them to be your next queen. And so Esther, at the suggestion of Mordecai, entered this contest, but she withheld the fact that she was Jewish. She didn't tell anybody that she was Jewish. She just entered the contest. And guess what? The king laid eyes on her, and he was smitten. He's like, that's the one, right? And so he chose her to be his next queen. And so now we have a few years pass. She's been coronated. She's his queen. And there's a man named Haman, and he ascended to be the chief officer of the king. And Haman, in his new position, because Haman was not a chill guy. Let's call it that way. He was very proud. And he felt really, really strongly that because he had a position of authority, that people around him should have reverence to him because of that position, right? He wasn't a person that received this honor, because there's people that just, you give the honor willingly because you see their authority and you honor their authority because there's humility within their authority. He was like, no, my title gives me authority. You need to have reverence for me, right? And he found out that Mordecai was not willing to give him that reverence. He wasn't willing to do that because he wasn't willing to give praise to someone that wasn't his God, right? And so he was really faithful to the Lord, and he didn't want to do something against the Lord by bowing or giving reverence to this man. And Haman didn't like that. And so he found out that he was Jewish, and he's like, oh, it's because you're Jewish you don't want to give me the honor and the respect that I deserve. So he decided to draft up a law and ask the king to put his seal on this law. And this law basically said that everybody of the Jewish ethnicity would be murdered, would be exterminated, wiped out. And so when Mordecai found out about this, he tried to figure out, well, what do we do? We need to stop this, right? And so he's like, wait, my cousin, my adopted daughter, is in the palace. She can go talk to the king. She can do something about this. So he asked Esther to intervene. And so we see in Esther chapter 4, verse 6, if we can put it up there. It says, so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go to the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. So verses 6 through 9, Hathach, and this is a new character in our story, he was a eunuch. He worked in the palace. And Mordecai sent Esther all the background info of what Haman was doing through this one person. And due to her role and title, Esther did not know what was going on, because she's just the queen, and she's just supposed to, be beautiful and lounge around all day, and she didn't have to deal with politics. And in fact, they were sequestered away from that part of the palace that dealt with the politics. So she didn't know what was happening. So Mordecai had to let her know, hey, Jews are about to be exterminated. Verse 10, then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends his gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So she's letting him know, hey, you know that nobody can go before the king unless he calls them, right? Unless they're summoned. And the only exception is if the king extends his gold scepter and says, basically by that motion, that you're exempt from that law, that rule, that law that says you can't go to the king without being called. And she said 30 days. Imagine being 30 days. He hasn't seen his queen. She's like, it's been 30 days since he called me, so I don't expect him to call me to his presence anytime soon. Right? So she's like, how are we going to do this? Right? So the request for Esther was that she intercede with the king, but two elements then combined against her, right? He's short-tempered, right? We have a short-tempered king, and we have a law prohibiting that people come before him. And so she makes this clear to Mordecai. What you're asking me is a very, very hard ask, right? Because if he does not, if I go before his presence and he doesn't extend his golden scepter, I'm going to be put to death. And it's clear that this king isn't doesn't care about getting another queen, right? He's already done it once, he's going to do it again. And so Mordecai understood, though, that the cause that he was asking her for was God's cause, right? It wasn't his own cause. He wasn't asking Esther to save his own skin. He was asking Esther to save the skin of every Jewish person, people that had been chosen by God himself, right? And so he knew that this was God leading him in this mission. And so verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? So Mordecai understood her response. Mordecai understood her fear. He wasn't saying, no, it's an irrational fear. No, he understood that. However, he couldn't abandon his request, and he couldn't leave it at that, right? And he's reminding her, don't think that because you're in the king's house, you alone among all the Jews are going to be spared, right? It's like he essentially says, it's going to catch up to you eventually. And while it catches up to you, God will find another way to deliver his people. He was insightful, right? Because he wasn't upset with her, but he was letting her know, I understand you got skin in the game. I understand you're putting yourself out there. But remember, if you save yourself at the expense of everybody else, eventually it will catch up to you. Eventually your turn will come. And we have a mighty God that regardless of whether you decide to act or not, he's going to figure out a way to do something about this, right? So he was very insightful, and he was letting her know, like, yes, I understand this, but you also need to understand this, right? This thing about our God. And so, yeah, if the royal mandate is fulfilled, yeah, you'll die, but at least it will have been worth it, right? Because you at least you died attempting to save the Jewish people. You died attempting trying to save the people of God, right? And you never know. Maybe you don't die because you're successful, right? And so Mordecai understood that God was behind this cause and that God would provide a way to save his people from certain annihilation. Because what were we singing? I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe that you're going to do it again. Mordecai had seen the Lord and heard about the Lord doing things for his people over and over again and saving them and delivering them, right? He delivered them from Egypt, right? He crossed them over the Jordan. He delivered them from their enemies, from the Philistines, time and time again, right? So Mordecai knew. Mordecai was learned, right? So he knew. He had heard the stories of God delivering his people, right? And so Mordecai knew that God was going to deliver them again. But he believed that Esther was the best chance. He believed that maybe your life story from becoming an orphan to now becoming the king's queen was for a reason, right? You were led to this place of high authority for a reason, such as today, for a time such as this, right? And so Mordecai, I think, really, really believed that, like, I didn't know where your life was going, but now things are starting to be clear. Like, you're there for a reason, right? And this message should resonate with all of us. God keeps us in position sometimes because he has a plan for us. Sometimes we feel like we're stuck somewhere and we're like, God's not moving me. But you still probably have a reason to be there, right? The Lord has a plan for you, and you just need to still be there and wait for him, right? You just need to wait for the opportunity that God's going to show you and reveal for when you need to take advantage of it, right? And so Esther then understood, you know what? I am in a privileged position. So let's do this, right? And so we have a question. Does your position of influence, do you use your position of influence to guide others, right? And when I say influence, it doesn't mean that you're like you have a leadership position or that you're a supervisor at work. I mean, even in your own home, do you use your influence over your children? Right? Over your nieces and nephews that are younger, right? Older brothers and sisters, do you use your influence over your younger brothers and sisters? And you guide them, right? The process took a few days, right? The back and forth took a few days between Esther and Mordecai. And I'm sure during those days, they were heavy days. They were long days, right? For Esther, weighing her choice, weighing her decision, waiting for Mordecai's response. Hey, I told him that I could die. What's he going to come back with? Right? Because I'm sure, like, being raised by him, she knew him, right? And I'm sure she knew, like, he's not going to let this go. So what's his response going to be, right? And it was not an easy decision to come to. But the arguments that her mentor made weighed heavy on her. And she trusted his advice and and his dependence on her action. Right? She was like, he's depending on me. And I trust him, and so I'm going to go forward. And so the deciding moment, we find it in Esther 4, verse 15 through 17. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So Mordecai's rearing of Esther yielded the expected fruits, the expected results. Right? He's listening to him. The future of his people was at stake, so the faith, the obedience, the good judgment that he had poured into her were of utmost importance, and they were coming to bear. They were coming to fruit. And so Mordecai doesn't say to her, but Esther knew that she needed to depend on God as well, right? Because Mordecai's request wasn't about a human matter anymore, right? In verse 16, when she says, go gather all the Jews who are in Susa, and she calls for a fast of 3 days and 3 nights, right? The Jewish community was in extreme danger, and they were coming on a date when they would be exterminated. So she's like, you guys need to fast and pray. And she says, pray with me, right? So they began a fast for what she was about to do to go before the king. And so this way she felt supported by her community, right? And why does she need the support? Well, because her main disadvantage was her main enemy hated her, and he had the king's ear, right? Luckily, he didn't know that she was Jewish, because she probably would have been the first one that he would have tried to wipe out, right? And so Esther needed to know that everyone was interceding with God on her behalf. So it's important to depend on God, right? And Esther knew this. And so she called her entire community to be with her in depending on God. But she didn't only ask others to help her. She said, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When we share burdens, they're easily bearable, right? They become more easily bearable. And so when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So on its face, it was kind of reckless, right? Because at the end of the day, she's admitting it. If I perish, I perish. And it sounds very matter of fact, but it's a reckless thing that she's doing. And so that's why she needed to fast and pray. And that's why she needed her community to fast and pray, to seek the Lord, right? Right, we know that here, right, the Lord has inclined his ear to hear us, right? And so she was like, we need to get the Lord to hear us. Like, knock on heaven's door, right? Like, hey, God, hear us. Please work in our favor. And so it's reckless, but she took the risk, because sometimes you need to take risk in life. It's a faith matter. Right, we call it risk, but really it's just faith. Where is your faith placed? Right, and I've made this example before to you. Sometimes we think we're at the edge of a precipice. We think like we're at the side of a cliff. And God is saying, just step down. And we're like, what do you mean step down? I'm at the side of a cliff. Right, and remember when the army had surrounded the prophet and his helper. And the helper's like, what are we going to do? Look at the army. And he's like, Lord, please open his eyes so that he sees that those that are with us are greater than those against us, right? And so like we're like, Lord, I'm on the side of a cliff, and then Lord opens our spiritual eyes, and it's like, just do it. It's like, okay. Oh, I was just at a step. But he needed to see our faithfulness, right? Right? Because how many times is the Lord asking us to do life or death things like Esther? Right? If we're lucky to be used by the Lord in that way, we'll probably only get it once. Right? The Lord isn't always asking us for life or death situations, but we make them seem so. Right? We make it seem like, oh my God, the world is about to end. My life is going to crumble down on me, but I'm trusting in the Lord. And it's great because it like we make so much of it, and then we do it, and then it builds our faith, and we're like, oh, that wasn't that bad. I can trust in God. Right? Because next time it's going to be 2 steps. But I've already done 1, so I can do 2. Right? This is a teachable moment for all of us. Right? Sometimes when we're in leadership, those under on leadership can be called, can be right in their actions too, right? Because she's like, well, let's pray about this. Because Mordecai didn't bring up the prayer and fasting. She brought up the prayer and fasting. Right? And he was obedient. He was like, okay, yeah, we'll do it. Sometimes people under us have good ideas, right? As the elder, as a father figure, it should have been expected that Mordecai would have been like, but before you do that, we're going to go into prayer and fast mode, right? But it was Esther that did it, right? It says Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So maybe parents, you don't always have all the brilliant ideas. All the kids like, yeah. Like they're like, yeah, very, very slow. Yeah. It's important to recognize that our children sometimes make good recommendations. They make good contributions, right? They have good suggestions. If you raise them properly, shouldn't you consider them as well? Like, are you trusting on how you rear your children? Should you not hear them out and respect their opinion? We don't always have to do what they say, but hear them out. What do they have to say? Right? When something is good and agreeable, then we have to have the humility to say, okay, fine, let's do this. Right? Even if it comes from our children. Even if it comes from people beneath us. Right? And so to encourage others to follow God's leading, no matter the cost, there are several things that we can do. And you guys have your things in there. They're written for you guys in there, just so you remember them. Right? Let's be sincere. Right? Answer truthfully to yourself. Are you putting off some opportunities to be a good mentor to someone? Especially a young person or a child. Maybe someone in your own family. Right? Why do you keep putting it off? Let's consider it, right? This mentee doesn't have to live with you, right? Just be willing to have this individual in front of your mind, right? Be aware of what they're doing and the challenges that they're facing. Accompany him or her in their path. Guide them. Present yourself as a role model, especially when it comes to spiritual values, right? Stay attentive. Ask the Lord to show you opportunities to act. Ask the Lord to show you opportunities when you can pour into them. Is this a teachable moment? What can I say to them that's going to bless them? Sometimes even in failure, right? What can I do that's not going to push them even further down where they're feeling right now because of this failure, but how can I lift them up? How can I make this a teachable moment for them where they're not fixated on the failing and the falling, but they're fixated on what to avoid next time, how to do it better next time, right? It's like when little kids like learn how to run and walk, right? And they hit a pebble and like they step on it and like it gives them out kilter and they fall. Well, what do they know next time? Look for pebbles and avoid them, right? Little kids are really smart, right? Then they're like, okay. Right? So when a little kid falls, it's like, see, you're dumb. You should have looked at the pebble. No. First of all, they're probably crying, so they're like, oh, it's okay, right? And sometimes we have to treat our mentees like that. It's okay. Failure is part of the process sometimes, but we have to learn, right? So let's get up and let's move forward, right? Like, be good role models in that way as well, right? Everything should be natural and not forced, right? This is a long-range race. No matter how far away in distance or time the goal is, it won't be in vain. Remember that the result is given by God. So you may never see the result yourself, but God will cause the fruit to bear at its time. So you reap what you sow. Remember that time goes faster than we imagine it, right? How many of you guys remember just getting married and now you're grandparents? Time flies, right? You reap what you sow. And remember that God's in control, no matter the time. Maybe it's not in your time to see the fruit, but in its time, the fruit will bear, right? And so we often worry too much about the cost of making a decision in our life. We make calculations in our minds. We forget to factor we have God's help, right? Because we look at the natural, we look at the physical, and we're like, okay, it's all these things, and this can come out of it. But hey, God is there to help you, right? If we're under God's direction, then we need to have faith that the results, while maybe they're unpredictable to us, are going to be favorable in the end. What God does is good, and he finishes everything he starts. So don't forget to add God to the equation when you're making that mental math. Teamwork is always better than doing it alone. Mordecai made a perfect team with Esther, right? Both were vigilant to make sure that things went well and according to God's divine plan. They didn't discount each other, right? When they were going back and forth, they were like, no, you're wrong. Like, that's a terrible idea. No, they just had a discourse. They went back and forth with each other. They didn't force the other to act against their own will. And still the results were favorable, not only to them, but to the whole Jewish people. And within this story, we learned that the proud, like Haman, have bad endings. In this case, Haman ended up in the gallows. Those who humble themselves, like Mordecai and Esther, will be exalted to the highest recognition, right? And we know that. The Bible tells us that in many places. First by God and then by society. With the Lord's approval, nothing will go wrong. But it does require you to be bold. And so if you guys, where you are, can you close your eyes? And let's end this with a prayer, asking the Lord to allow us to be good mentors to the people we have around us. Lord, I pray that you allow us to see who is around me that I can mentor, Lord. Who is around me that I can pour into. I don't have to look far away, Lord. Please show me those people closest to me. And Lord, I pray that as you reveal that person that I need to mentor and I need to pour into, I pray that you make me attentive and obedient to your ways, to your will, to your divine guidance. That I don't force this upon them or upon myself, Lord, but that I find opportunities where they arise to be a good mentor, to give good advice, to give comfort, to give aid. Lord, that I may feel blessed enough to be able to pour into someone even if I don't see the results of what I sow. Lord, sometimes I will reap what somebody else sowed, and sometimes somebody else will reap what I sowed. And that is okay, Lord. Allow me to be okay and at peace with that as well. Teach me to do this, to be a mentor in the best way possible, in the most loving way possible, in a way that honors and glorifies you, Lord. And I pray that the fruits, Lord, whenever they bear, Lord, will be magnificent fruit. It will be fruit that will extend your kingdom, Lord, will move your kingdom forward. And I pray that what I pour into this person will be for their benefit, Lord. Will give him a pleasant and wonderful life, Lord, because they will have values, Lord, that come not from me, but that come from you. And they will be strong. They will be anchored on the cornerstone, which is Jesus Christ. We thank you, Lord, for your blessings. We thank you, Lord, please show us and reveal to us who we need to mentor. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.